Hello and welcome to the latest episode of the CCIR Spotlight Interviews. So hi, my name is Lucy and I'm here today with Blu to talk about her work within the Race, Racism and Society section, where she's been looking at the translation or the adaptation of Japanese anime within the United States and within one specific anime, which she'll be telling us a little bit more about later. So first of all, I'd like to hand over to Blu and ask you to introduce yourself a little bit, maybe say a few words about who you are, what you're up to, and then also a brief introduction of your project.
Hi, Lucy. Very nice to meet you. My name is Blu Tran. I'm from Vietnam, and I'm currently home for the summer, but I'll be going back to the States in September for my senior year. It's going to be a pretty hectic year applying to colleges and all, but I'm excited. My project was initially I wanted to investigate anime adaptations done by the United States from 2010s and forward. And coming in, I know that I wanted to choose a live action that still had the Japanese setting and had some sort of Asian/Japanese representation. And having those criteria in mind, I could only choose Ghost in the Shell. And with my research, I explored their differences, what the director wanted to change artistic-wise, I think so. And the plot changes, things like that, and what that indicates and how that changed the representation of the movie.
Cool. So when you were choosing this film, was this something that did you previously know about it, or was it in the course of your background research that you came across Ghost in the Shell?
I had heard of Ghost in the Shell a few years ago, coming into this project, I didn't know that I would be doing intensive research about it.
Nice. And for those of us who maybe have not seen the movie, would you be able to give us a brief plot summary we could expect?
Yes, the original version was an adaptation from the original comic, and the production was in 1995, I believe, and it's set in futuristic Japan, where technology has evolved to a point where we can have cybernetic parts. It's to say cyborg and human can coexist, and you can only need to preserve the brain part of a human body and put it in an entirely robot body, and that body could function as a human.
Wow. That sounds
very interesting.
Both futuristic, but also something I think science is almost not working towards, but exploring in terms of how humans and technology can link. So an interesting.
It's really ahead of its time.
Yeah. And then, so I guess the first of all, big question would be then, in the American version, is the plot similar, or are there any big changes that you noticed?
The plot is similar, but I did not necessarily explore this in my paper because it wasn't relevant, but it had a controversial view when it was released that they casted a white woman for the role of the Japanese lead. I didn't necessarily explore this in my paper, as there was the argument that because the lead was a cyborg and her shell could be anything, they didn't think that it was needed to be a Japanese shell. I just thought it was an interesting point to mention.
Yeah, well, definitely when you were adapting something from one culture, when it's based in the American version, is it still based in a futuristic Japan, or is it based in a futuristic America?
Oh, it was still set in futuristic Japan, which is why I used it for my project. The base of the plot was very similar. They still had the same conflicts as the original. In the original, the main conflict and the themes they were trying to explore is how are humans and robots different? How does someone know that they're real? And how does their identity, because the main character is a woman who's gotten into some sort of accident, and her brain is then put into a cybernetic body. And then she struggles to understand that. How is she different from a robot? Is she real? Is any of her decisions herself, and things like that? It's very nuanced, and the movie doesn't necessarily state that it's a bad thing. They just say that it's very complicated, and we need to figure out a way to coexist with this very technologically advanced world we're living in. Like,
Wow.
there's no black or white, right or wrong. It's just a very gray area. And I think that's one of the very great things about that movie. And in the American version, they kept all the important points, like the futuristic setting, the cybernetic bodies, and the internal struggle of the main character. But they had a way of developing the story that was very negative towards this technologically advanced world. And in my research, I came across something called techno-Orientalism, which, like the name suggests, it's a combination of technology and Orientalism.
I could see the fact that representation matters when you're talking in this particular context. So I fully take your point about having then a white female shell for what's traditionally a Japanese character. And so I'm interested to see, maybe if you explain a little bit more, if you feel comfortable, about the technological Orientalism, then how that might potentially play into this representation or lack of representation. Because I think it sounds like there's a lot of quite key philosophical questions within this film, within this anime, that's explored around man's relationship with technology, and exactly what it does, what it means to be human. There's a lot of deep issues being explored.
Right. Techno-Orientalism is the phenomenon of using Asia or an Asian country as this exotic place where this futuristic world, yet it's just a dystopian world, is set in. It's common in a lot of science fiction movie, and because in the past, Asia or the East has been depicted as backwards or primitive, and now with the very rapid economization and advances that the East has made, I don't think they can use that particular narrative anymore. And now the West has spinned it into this. Yes, they are technologically advanced, but emotionally they are stunted, or in other aspects, it's still not as developed as the West. And there's something inherently wrong about the East.
Well, it's just kind of taken that they needed to find a way of, from what you're saying, kind of trying to find a way to maintain that distance, to find some way of separation, and where they couldn't be a separation in terms of progress, it's now you're almost too far progressed technologically, and therefore there must be different pitfalls and problems with that.
And now they're just not human anymore. They're just so far ahead that they're just seen as this object.
In terms of, you're saying, looking at the project, it was about how this anime or this movie had been then adapted in America. Do you feel then, in terms of the translation of the cultural elements of the film, that there's a section within your research of looking at sort of misrepresentation of then Asian and specifically Japanese culture, in terms of not understanding things that might then be portrayed that for them are part of the culture, but then in this American film are portrayed as being more emotionless or lacking in that human depth? And maybe you could give a couple of examples of a scene or a part of the film where you really felt that come through.
There was one character addition into the American version. There was a robot geisha, which is a very traditional way of dressing in Japanese culture, I think, is a female entertainer. And then in the American version, she's a robot. And her role was very little, and it wasn't very much importance, but it wasn't something that they had in the original version. And I felt as if this addition was only to increase the exoticness of the movie. Like it's set in Japan. And so they had this mysterious Asian presenting character just to heighten that exoticness. And it wasn't to serve any of anything. It was kind of one dimensional.
And very interesting, as you say, given that they had already chosen for the main character to not be an Asian representing character, then the fact that they did include Asian representing characters, but then not within that main role and within a role which is potentially more culturally stereotypical when, from the West looking at different elements of Japanese culture. So when you were starting this project, obviously having to think about the movie that you would like to explore and then the context of that, when you began the process, what were your first steps? Were you looking in terms of, were you doing lots of cultural research, looking at the context of Japan, or was that something that you already had a foundation in and that you were interested in exploring more about when you signed up for this project?
I had a slight, I didn't have a foundation knowledge, I would say. I had some knowledge of Japanese culture and how these live actions often misrepresent them, but I still had to do some research myself.
And then did you find, so the process was for you then starting with this contextual research, or did you start with individual analysis of the film and then build the contextual cultural research onto that afterwards? What was your process for moving through the project?
I first did some reading on Japanese culture and how it translates into their media, the anime. And then I was interested in seeing how this would translate into the United States, see how they would translate and how it would translate itself, things like that. So I knew that the West and Hollywood did some adaptations of these. So I started looking into the movies they did more recently, the 2010s forward. And I watched a few, and most of them, understandably, put the setting in the West for to appeal to Western audience. And so I knew I had to choose something that's still a bit related to Japan.
And then was there any particular, when you were doing that research and kind of starting with your project, were there any particular ideas or papers that really stood out to you or really helped inform how you were going to look at the movie? Or was it just a good ensemble altogether to help you start that process?
There wasn't any paper that stood out. I think I knew from the start that I wanted to look into how the West represented Asia, but I only knew that I wanted to focus specifically on anime and their adaptations when I did some research later on.
Nice. And then in terms of being a part of the CCIR program, how did you find the support and the kind of teaching that you received along the way? How did that feed into the work that you were doing?
It was very supportive, I would say.
It's good to hear.
I think this is my second research project, but my first one was very different. It's structured differently, and I read on an entirely different topic. And I wasn't aware of the typical structure of how a research paper should be, like the methodology section, literature review, or anything like that. And the instructors and the TA were very patient, and they explained it a lot of times. I could send them my drafts freely, and they would proofread them, and give me feedback. It was very helpful.
So I know you said at the beginning that obviously the year coming up for you is going to be quite busy in terms of college applications and thinking about the future, but did you find then having this experience within the program as a good taster of what college life might be like, or kind of your university could look like for you? Was it a kind of inspiring step, something where you think I'd like to get more involved in this?
It's very refreshing. I feel like I did notice that it was a lot different than with the work I do in school now, and it's a lot more me, and I would have to organize a lot of it myself. There would be help available, but I would have to initiate that. And I think I it was intimidating, but I don't think I'm against it, honestly.
Yeah, I think it's definitely something, the step up to the kind of university, college, the further education level is a lot more of individual work and learning, having to get, as you say, get the support in terms of structure from academic staff, but then being responsible for filling out that structure with your own work. But do you think this topic, in terms of cultural translation and adaptation of anime into Western films, would that be something you'd be interested in researching more about?
I am, yes. This paper, I don't know exactly how far I would extend this paper yet, but I think this in the future could still be a very I don't know I can't find the word, but it can still be a really interesting topic to explore.
What do you think, just in terms of the future of this particular field? I don't know what you think in terms of the rise of the new artificial intelligence technologies, for example, that we're seeing, or also the human kind of wearable, portable, usable technologies that are appearing much more in everyday life. Do you think that might then have an impact in terms of these futuristic looking films, or also in terms of the techno-Orientalism? Could this be something that's to be developed further in terms of research fields, or just in something to be aware of in life as we go forward and we progress and we have more and more of these questions around what is the fine line that we can draw between human and technology?
I feel like that's a very complex topic. but I think it's, as for techno-Orientalism, I think it's very still very present today, even if it's not as noticeable as before. This is not academically. I've seen like videos online where they would show Japan or Korea as very technologically advanced. They would show all their gadgets and things on the streets, and they would have the captions as, "Oh, look at Japan living in 2030 or 2050 or something." And some part of me feels like it's putting Japan and Korea and all those East Asian countries on this pedestal and perpetuate this kind of otherness towards them. Yet at the same time, like South Asian countries and the rest of the Asian countries that aren't mentioned as much is still seen as primitive or poor, things like that.
Definitely, you see the disparity in terms of the image that people have, or kind of the Western representation of those countries, as you say, the difference between those who are represented as almost too progressive, too futuristic, and the ones that are seen as remaining in the past. And yeah, it was a complex question. I was just very curious to get your views as someone who's been looking into this, and I personally interested then to see how, for example, as the West starts to catch up in terms of the use of technology more and more within everyday life, whether that then will push these benchmarks even further in terms of what the futuristic image portrayed from some of the Asian countries, and how that might then change that relationship or representation. But definitely, I think something that might be worth of research in the future. But then for you personally, what was the experience like? On a very personal level, what would be takeaways from this project or from being a part of this project outside of what you've learned about the translation of anime and Japanese culture into an American film?
This was a very interesting experience because at first I was sure that I would have something to write about, and I switched my project topic like 5 different times. And it's because it's very different when I thought I had a lot of ideas to research about, but they were all done. So I couldn't really do anything more about them. I could read about them, but that was it. I didn't have any ideas about my own research to do. So I had to take a while to figure that out. And the writing process was also interesting because I've written papers in school and I didn't think 3,000 to 5,000 words were that much. But starting writing, and then I had to find a way to expound on my ideas more. And it was a difficult process, but it was rewarding, I guess, in a sense.
You've come out with a finished product, which is your kind of own research paper on a pretty interesting topic. And did you see, you were saying about how it was useful to have the kind of mentors and TAs around to read drafts. How did you, and that you also had to learn about the structuring of a research paper a bit more in terms of the academic world. But did you really, what were the sort of biggest differences then within from the first draft to the final finished piece? Can you see for yourself a bit of a journey or a development in that? Or what do you think were the biggest things you learned then along the way?
I definitely did see a difference because we had homeworks along the way and they would also send us back our work with the feedbacks. And I can see because I would reread the earlier ones and I could see a change in the structure. And it was a lot easier to understand. Just the overall structure. That sounds like just a small thing, but it really does help your paper.
No, definitely. And I think it's as well helps you and your mind be a bit clearer in terms of the argument and the work that you've done when you can have a clear layout. It's not just for the people that read it, but for the people that write it too. You can see then how your work's developed. So yeah, it sounds like a really interesting paper to read. So I think, unfortunately, that's the time that we have for this interview, but I wanted to thank you so much for talking to me this morning and sharing a bit about your experience. And it sounds like a really interesting topic. I might have to go and look up the film now afterwards and see if I can see the points that you're talking about. So yeah, and then fingers crossed, all goes well with the college applications.
Thank you so much for spending time with me.